Hey, Belong Collective, welcome to this special midweek interview that I do with George Hajduczok. And this isn't something we normally do on the Belong Collective. The Belong Collective, we do a lot of interviews with authors and talk about their book, especially when it's related to faith or justice or any number of things. But today I interview George Hajduczok, who's a doctor and a lawyer and a Ukrainian American who was born here in America, but parents immigrated from Ukraine. And he shares so much knowledge and history about the conflict, the war that we're seeing currently, that I felt like our community needed to see that. Now, here's some reasons why. I just want to be clear, because this gets into politics, right? And I know we all have our own political lens that we see through, but this really helps, I think, us understand the conflict in our world that's happening, that's maybe even, providing some anxiety for us as we consider the consequences of what this could mean. And so some reasons I think this is important for our community to talk about, be knowledgeable about, hear from direct sources, people who know Ukraine, who have family and friends in Ukraine. The reason I think that is because as people who want to expand a loving ethic in our world, we should see suffering in the world and desire to understand it, desire to be informed about what we can do to champion peace and justice in the world. Now, I'll be honest, we can't be aware of every single conflict in the world. There's so much happening in the world. But when something does capture our hearts, our minds, and when it's something that maybe we don't know a whole lot about or have not done the homework or history to understand, the conflicts that are existing, whether for many of those conflicts, they might be religious. For some of them, it might be territorial. For some of them, it might be just wholly political and power-based. And sometimes gaining an understanding, a knowledge of the history can inform us best on how to advocate for the future. And so when we desire to be people who bring heaven to earth, right, that our actions would bring heaven to earth, that there's a wholeness and a peace and a fullness that maybe we can participate in bringing, right? Sometimes that requires knowledge and understanding. Actually, almost always that requires knowledge and understanding. And my hope with this, and after I interviewed Dr. George Hajduczok, I was like, man, I gotta get this out to our community, the Belong Collective, because I really feel like this will help for many people who are probably watching the news and hearing sound bites and clips and just frustrated and don't understand the conflict, don't understand Ukrainian culture very well. This might be something that really helps them put some pieces together. So a couple things really quick. Here in a minute, you're going to flash to a Zoom interview, and it's just going to be myself and George Hajduczok talking for a couple hours. So strap in, or take this in bite-sized chunks, whatever you have the capacity for. But I also want to say, either in the notes of the post of this post or in the comment section of this post, there's going to be some links. Dr. Hajduczok's going to reference those in the conversation toward the end. But these are links for different organizations that you can support, that can help provide aid or provide support to those on the ground or refugee camps that are beginning to pop up all over where goods and supplies are needed. And so if that's something that you want to support, whether that's through donating resources or donating financial, donating money, or potentially even volunteering, or even just getting on their website, giving them a like and just thanking them for the work they're doing. Maybe you don't have the capacity to donate, but I'll tell you this, as someone who works at a nonprofit, whenever you have someone notice your work, acknowledge it, and thank you for it, it can go a long way in providing energy and drive for you to just continue doing what you're doing. And so I encourage you, even if you can't give financially, to maybe give a word of encouragement or gratitude to those who are doing this work, especially right now as their work is really helping a lot of people and is so incredibly necessary. So again, not a typical Belong Collective, Wednesday. This wouldn't be something we would typically do, but here we are. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with Dr. George Hajduczok. All right, welcome to Beyond Boundaries. I have George Hajduczok with me. George, you are a doctor and a lawyer, right? Is this correct?
Yeah, that is absolutely correct. Yeah.
And so, I know you better as my friend Alex's dad, which is kind of cool. So talk a little bit about your background and share a little bit about what you do, who you are, as we kind of get into this conversation about Ukraine. I'm really excited to hear you drop some wisdom on me and understanding.
All right. So I just as a qualifier, I'm not a historian. So when it comes to asking history questions, I'm okay with the history of Ukraine. I was born here in the United States. My mom and dad were born in Ukraine, 1920 and 1923. So they lived through a lot. We could get into that a little more as we go. So I was brought up here in the U.S. Even though English is my second language technically, because everybody spoke Ukrainian in the house. Although I did learn most of my English before I went to kindergarten, from my older brother and sister. So I think I rarely ever spoke to my parents in English, and I rarely ever spoke to my in-laws in English to this day. So so it's always been Ukrainian, and growing up Ukrainian in the Ukrainian culture, with Ukrainian scouting organizations, as well as church organizations. Post World War II, as in most eastern cities in the U.S., there was a large immigration from Ukraine, post World War II immigration. Of people that were displaced from Ukraine by the Nazis, and fleeing the Soviets as well. So they all settled around a church basically in every city. So in the 50s and the 60s, the typical communities were, you have a Ukrainian church surrounded by a Ukrainian community. You have the German church surrounded by a German community. And right next to that is the Polish church surrounded by the Polish community, and so on and so forth. So, and then all the organizations maintaining the cultures and so on. So I was brought up there. My school experience was with Americans, quote unquote. We always call non-Ukrainians Americans growing up, and we do, and we interacted because of churches and organizations with all our Ukrainian friends. So we always had our Ukrainian friends and our American friends, mainly from school or the neighborhoods. But I went to school here, got my got my degree in biology, PhD, and then I did a postdoctoral fellow, and then in University of Iowa, and then eventually we came back to Buffalo. And at some point, I was a faculty here, full-time faculty at the University of Buffalo Medical School in physiology and biophysics, which is what my PhD is in. And then went totally rogue one day and decided to go to law school, and got a law degree while the kids were little, dropping them off at daycare and all that, and then kind of moving forward. And one day I found myself in a law firm after I graduated from law school. I still maintained my appointment there while I was in law school and taught the medical students and all that. My research activities went down, of course. And then ended up with the law firm here in Buffalo, Phillips Lytle, that is also has offices in New York and Washington D.C. and a little bit in Canada. And so I do pharmaceutical litigation and FDA regulatory work, medical devices, pharmaceuticals, and so on. So that's kind of my general background there.
That's amazing that you I mean, the work it takes to become a doctor, and you were like, I didn't go to school enough. I think I need to go some more. Like, and you didn't choose like something easy. You were like, how about law? How about law school? Why not? How about that? That's
Yeah,
pretty
it's just
awesome.
random. Yeah.
That's really
Yeah. I
cool.
mean, it turned out, I mean, it was a crazy thing because in the early 90s, um, I'll just give you a quick personal story of how I got to the whole law school thing is in the early 90s, I was a postdoc or new faculty here at the university at Buffalo. And I was doing grant reviews for NIH as my, scientific community service thing, going down to Washington and reviewing grants, and started getting into, this thing for intellectual property and, patenting and things. And that came up because at the time, there were, people were starting to talk about, can you patent biological entities and can you patent genes? And
Wow.
so that became a big issue. And in reviewing grants, things started coming up more and more. Started thinking about it, reading about it, but a lot of back burner stuff while I was doing my real job in research and things. And then, one day we were talking with my wife, and it's like, you're really kind of getting into us. You should become a patent attorney. I'm like, nah, I don't know anything about law. All I know is how, I've seen the animated video of how how a law, a legislation becomes
Yeah.
law or something like
Yeah.
that.
I remember
Yeah,
that the
I
little
knew,
PBS roll of like the bill tells you how a law
yeah,
becomes
yeah,
law.
how a
That's
bill
good.
becomes a
Yeah,
law.
yeah,
So it
yeah,
was like a
yeah. Yeah.
SpongeBob thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And, I knew that there were three branches of government, and that was pretty much it. But I started thinking about it more and more over the next few years. And so, and then at one point, I injured my knee doing some martial arts, and I was laid up for a while. And I was like, okay, let's apply.
That's
Let's
awesome.
take the LSAT. What's this thing all about?
That's
But
amazing. That's so cool.
yeah, so we did that, and it turned out, about patenting genes and this whole, getting to the, sequencing the DNA of the human genome. It turned out that the major proponent of that, thrusting, the research, was my former biochemistry professor, Craig Venter.
Oh,
So he
wow.
ended up being the head of that effort from the private sector. And then you have Francis Collins and National Institutes of Health being the drivers from the government side.
Yeah.
And he won.
That's
So
amazing.
um, yeah,
Yeah, and
so
that's still a
but
very relevant conversation. Intellectual
oh,
property is still a super relevant conversation, especially in the tech world. And so, I mean,
oh,
obviously in medicine too, I would assume, with everybody creating different vaccines slash medicines, I'm sure patent laws and like all that kind of stuff is still has only become more relevant as things have expanded. So I'm sure your
oh.
work is pretty necessary in the world.
Right, and then also on a global scale, because we have, patent issues between countries, and
Oh
we
yeah.
hear about China stealing intellectual property and all that. So yeah, so this is a big global issue, and not just, medical device and pharmaceuticals and
Yeah.
the other technologies in life sciences and so on. But
Well,
that
that's
we're
cool.
starting to actually go down a different
That's
different
all right.
lane.
No, that's all right. It's cool to get to know a little bit of your background and a little bit of what you do now. Tell me a little bit about your parents. You said your parents came here. How old were they when they came here?
Yeah, they actually immigrated to the U.S. in 1950. So
Okay.
they're basically, 1920. They were born 1950, so they're 30 years old
Yeah.
approximately. But the route that they took was quite unusual, but not quite unusual for the times, because both my parents, they were in different villages just outside of Lviv, which is the major city in Western Ukraine that you hear about now.
Okay. Yeah.
That's closer to the Polish border. And so during World War II, when the Nazis came through Poland and eventually came across the border into Ukraine, those were the first, villages. That was the first area in Western Ukraine that was being taken over by the Nazis.
Mhm.
And what they typically did was go into villages. Of course, depending on the resistance, they didn't deal with resistance very well. And they kind of took care of that, those things. And, the way my father always described it, they would come in, they would end up hanging a few people on trees that were resistors, and then they would line up everybody in a village, and essentially for the people that were able to work, so you're talking about the 16-year-olds and above, essentially they gave them the option: you can join your compatriots on the trees, or you could get on a train and go to work at a labor camp in Germany. And because the Germans really needed all their nationals to be either on the front lines or part of the the Volksdeutsch, part of the German war effort, they needed laborers. And so what the Nazis would do is come in, and wherever they would conquer, they would take people back, put them in forced labor camps, and have them drive the war machine from that aspect. My dad worked in the train station in a labor camp. My mom was a nurse's aide, and that's how they actually met after a bombing in Hanover during the war, when the Allied forces were bombing. My dad was walking around just outside of a factory that got bombed, and he got so concussed he had no idea where he was. He had some shrapnel, some cuts and bruises. He was okay. Eventually, a friend of his found him just kind of wandering around, dazed and confused, and then took him to the hospital. There, he was in a bed next to one of his other friends that was also injured in the bombing. And so they were just kind of convalescing and being taken care of at the hospital. And my dad's friend that was in the next bed had some visitors, and it was his friend's girlfriend that would come and visit. And she one time brought along my future mom.
Wow.
And that's how they met there. And then they ended up being, making it through the war. And these weren't the, like the Jewish extermination camps, but these were the labor camps.
Yeah. So was that in Germany? Just for clarity, was that?
So that was in Germany, in Hanover, and there were a number of places. Once the the Allied forces, U.S. and Allied forces, came in and liberated Germany, then for the next 5 years, basically, for most people, they where does everybody go now that it's liberated? People have been displaced from all different countries. It's not just Ukraine, but many that did come from Ukraine. And at that time, Stalin had the deal of we want our people back, to be part of the USSR again. We want them back. And my parents were like, no way. They were already married at that point. And they decided, no, we'll immigrate somewhere else. We're not going back, because unfortunately, the thousands of people that ended up going back to the Soviet Union were either executed on the spot for being collaborators with the Germans, or essentially shipped off to Siberia, where they put on trains, minimal tools, dropped off in the middle of nowhere, and say, this is your town, go live. And if you can survive and build a place to stay and live, you're on your own. And many people died there. So this was, in addition to any gulags where, more political prisoners were being sent and so on. So my parents, stayed, and they were left in Germany in a displaced persons camp until they had the opportunity to immigrate. They needed a sponsor back then. And so one of my dad's friends was able to get a sponsor to go to Australia. And then they actually sponsored my mom and dad to go to Australia, to immigrate to Australia. Well, they were all set to go in a week, to get on a ship, go up to the port city and go and immigrate to Australia. But my dad was helping another friend doing some masonry work on a stove and he got a little chip of brick in his eye. He had to go to the infirmary. They put a patch on his eye, And then they basically said after that, the immigration people said, you can't immigrate, you have an injury. Get back in line, find somebody else. So, fast forward, they were able to get another friend that was able to sponsor them to come to the United States. And that's how my family ended up in the United States. And I don't speak with an Australian accent.
I was going to say you're this close to being Australian.
Yeah,
that's pretty hilarious. Wow. So, for those of us who don't know history very well, you mentioned the Soviet Union. At that point, then Ukraine's not really liberated in any way, even though World War II is over. They're liberated in the sense that, look, I don't have to be in a labor camp anymore, but to go home is incredibly risky. And politically speaking, there's no independence, because
correct.
You're kind of part of this greater union, the Soviet Union. Now, how long did the Soviet Union last, and how long was it like that for refugees coming back? Till
okay.
Or give me a little bit of a history. Give me a little bit of a history if you want to answer it differently than that, or if you want to share a broader.
So we could go back. I mean, we could go back a long time, but over the years, like by around in the 1700s, I mean, we could go back 30,000 years.
Okay, yeah.
Which is a separate story, which will actually be interesting when we get there again.
Yeah.
But just to kind of bring it to tail on, the conversation that we've started. Ukraine has been kind of struggling for independence on and off for basically centuries.
Yeah.
It's you learn probably in high school that Ukraine was a breadbasket of the Soviet Union, and so it was very agrarian, agricultural, grain, wheat, corn, barley, all of that.
And it still is. It still is today, correct? I understand. I understand that that's actually a big issue that is being talked about right now. Is like that they supply, I want to say, Egypt with a good amount of grain and wheat and I don't know, some other stuff. So like that I just heard that's going to be a big issue potentially, even how it's going to affect other countries. But
because you're talking about Ukraine is essentially the size of Texas, that they always say, but it's the just a couple of quick stats. It's the number one in Europe as far as the size of agricultural land, and so it's number one in the world for exporting sunflower oil, number two in the world in terms of barley production, number three in the world in terms of black earth agricultural basis there, and potato production, it's number four in the world, number four in maize production, rye production, number five. I mean, you could go on and on. Wheat production, number 8 in the world, egg production. So there's a lot, but what many people don't realize is the mining industry is pretty rich as well, because it's number one in Europe when it comes to uranium deposits. Number two for titanium, and then we could go through, it's either 2, 3 or whatever for iron, magnesium, natural gas deposits, aside from Russia, which is large, but that's largely untapped. So there's a lot of natural resources, and not only that, but also, manufacturing industry. It's very big in ammonia and other chemicals, and it has huge gas pipelines going through the country that's supplying the rest of Europe. I mean, a lot of it comes through Russia, from Russia through Ukraine and out into a network that goes out to all the other countries, in Europe. So,
wow.
As far as resources, there's a lot more than you realize. And now, as you said, Justin, it's a big deal now because corn prices have skyrocketed since the invasion and in this war, and it's been going up even before because of the 2014 war. So it's Ukraine has a lot to offer from that aspect, but also these things impact and have a large ripple effect as far as supplying to Europe, but like you said, Egypt and many other exports to other countries.
Yeah, so they've always been agricultural, though, is what you're saying, even back in the past. So the Soviet Union used them largely, or saw them largely as a supplier of agriculture for the Union then. And then,
Right.
so that's kind of what they were known for during that season.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, Ukraine was, so it's always being conquered by somebody. A lot of it for resources, and a lot of it just because, I mean, our very nature is pretty tribal as far as, worldwide, and you want to be global, you want to be, friendly with your neighbors, but it doesn't take long till somebody has a resource that you need, and next thing you know, you're invading and taking over for those reasons, or for other geopolitical reasons as well, to solidify various connections and so on. So from the 1700s on, Ukraine has been on and off, being overrun by Lithuanian, Poland, Ottoman Empire, Russia, and so Russia for a long time through the 1800s actually, and then where there was a little uprising called the Russian Revolution in just after World War I, when Lenin was generating the masses in this Bolshevik revolution. At the same time, Ukraine was declaring its independence, and so in 1918, Ukraine declared its independence, but it was very short-lived, because by 1920-21, Russia came back in again and took it over. And then it had, it was controlled, and then, through the Stalin era, obviously, because then shortly in the 20s, when Stalin started getting into power, he had his eyes on Ukraine for a number of reasons. Obviously, one is, again, for the resources and the supplies and food and supplies that Ukraine can provide the rest of the Soviet Union, essentially, and the USSR, and in addition, he had a thing against Ukrainians, because they, he did not see them as equal, or even, didn't have a need for existence. And the reason, or a number of reasons, but one of the reasons was that they were going into this collectivist approach in society, and the Ukrainians were very resistant to that. So he sent in his people, and basically, it was the beginning of the forced starvation, man-made famine. And the way that came about was that Stalin's people came in, and they started taking the grain that was being made, and they would ship it out of Ukraine. But it was to the point where it didn't matter how much grain you were making, you were not left enough for yourself or for the people that were producing it. So in the cities, of course, they're the first ones that start, feeling the depth of the dire need of grain and foods, and bread lines were, just huge if they could get them. And then it just got worse and worse and worse, until you had a whole nation being starved on purpose. And to the extent that, the numbers range from 3.5 to about 7 million people starved during that man-made famine, and what we call that as the Holodomor, which is a man-made starvation, man-made famine. So that happened around 1932 to 1933.
Wow.
And then the opportunity for Stalin that arose after that was, well, now that people are, dead and gone, there are entire villages that were starved out. And so he started bringing in, the kind of the doctrine of Russification. So he brought in, people from Russia to start populating and inhabiting, those areas. So that they become ethnic Russians, they move into that area. They have, there were whole villages that nobody was there, and you just bring people in from Russia and said, this is all yours and go for it. And so
is this
slowly,
is this why the country currently speaks Ukrainian and Russian? Would it be
yes,
linked back to this moment?
So,
okay.
Yeah. So this is part of, the usual thing. You could either breed, the ethnicity or language out of you, or you could kill them off and replace them with your own people. And so, during the Soviet era, Russian was the main language. That's what was being taught in schools. Not everywhere people would still learn Ukrainian, and so on, but that wasn't the official language and part of the official education program. It was all Russian. So now you have this influx of people from the east in Ukraine, east part of Ukraine, from Russia, and so you have a much higher Russian-speaking population there. And generally, if you look at, there's the major river going through Ukraine, north-south, coming from Belarus all the way down to the Black Sea, is the Dnieper. I can't even say it in English. It's Dnipro in Ukrainian. That's what they call it, Dnipro in English, I'll say. And that's the main river, and largest river in Ukraine. And it's also a way to say, east versus west part of Ukraine. The east part, that starts getting into a little more of a higher population, greater population of Russian-speaking native, not necessarily all native Russians, but because we've gone through a number of generations now, and so people are born and raised in Ukraine, but just speak more Russian. Whereas in Western Ukraine, you have more Ukrainian speaking. Although a quick story of the difference in Russian and Ukrainian, or even Ukrainian in Ukraine versus Ukrainian here after the war, is different, because like when my parents came over, all the Ukrainians that came over and immigrated after the war came to the United States and Canada, say for instance, or through Western Europe, they to this day speak the older Ukrainian, the pre-World War II Ukrainian.
Okay.
The post-World War II Ukrainian dialect started changing because of the Russification issue that occurred. And so now you're starting to get more mixing and so on. And so when a lot of friends that immigrated after the fall of the Soviet Union, when in 1991, when Ukraine became independent, a number of people come over. You could tell right away that they're not, the old Ukrainian, they're more the new Ukrainian. They have slightly different accents, slightly different cadence to their speech pattern, and words, and then some mixing with Ukrainian, with a little Russian here and there. But it's still Ukrainian. It's just, you can distinguish. It's almost like when you go down south versus a northern, a northeast versus a southern, that kind of drawl. But now you're getting a little mix with Russian, on top of that. So there's a little bit of a twist there.
Yeah. I used to live in Boston, so I get it. The Boston accent makes no sense. So okay. So you said in the 90s we have independence. And whenever a country goes from oppression like that for so long to, and especially like you said, Russification, where they're experiencing a shift in culture applied to them, whether they like it or not. In 1991, when they experience independence, it's not like they're kicking everybody out overnight, like that. They're not going to immediately change cultures, right? So I'm assuming there was a little bit of a process to even know what to do with that independence, as far as like directionally, how tell me a little bit about the politics of freedom in that time, because I would guess in most cases when that happens, there's a lot of different people vying for power and a lot of different opinions that start to rise to the top, and you kind of have your own oppression of figuring out what ideas are going to work, right? Like that becomes the new struggle, if you will. The struggle was for independence, but now we have it. What do we do with it? Which direction do we go? Tell me a little bit about the 90s and maybe even the early 2000s, as far as like how that was working out, what was happening.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There was a big, there's a big change, obviously, with the fall of the Soviet Union. I mean, you had Gorbachev that allowed that with perestroika and the whole issue of going more west. And that became hard, more difficult to maintain the Soviet Union, especially because of economics. You have the Reagan era influence of military might build up. And one of the policies was, we'll build up our military, see if you can stay with us, keeping up with the Joneses. And when you have the entire Soviet, regime building up their military, well, their economy was suffering because of that. And so you start having more and more internal strife. And you get the politics, and now you have the communism, and now you're trying to get more close to the West, or at least Gorbachev was becoming more friendly, or had these kind of democratic ideals that were starting to, to percolate, and so on. And eventually, the Soviet Union broke apart, and then there you have Boris Yeltsin comes in. So from the Russian side, now it's the Russian Federation, and the other 13 republics are now independent. Ukraine is now an independent state in August 1991, and miraculously it became democratic, right? So basically, you took off your communist hat and you put on your democratic hat. Same people though. Were essentially in office, and now they, from being good Communist Party apparatchiks to, now we're going, Democratic. But that wasn't, it didn't happen overnight. Just like nothing happens overnight. We like to compress our history, by the decade or by the century or whatever. But so there was a lot of, what to do, and it was kind of like a Wild West scenario where everybody's on their own. So corruption was rampant. Where are we going to get food supplies, energy? How the government going to be developed? It's a presidential parliamentary government. The way it's set up, but who has influence? Who is being influenced still from Moscow? Because the ties didn't just kind of miraculously, break and, fly, be free. Moscow still had their fingers and talons basically in everything. And so you did, have, a lot of backroom dealings. And this is, and it's still, there's still issues to this day, not only in Ukraine, but in the other, former Soviet republic, Kazakhstan, Belarus especially, and things. And it depends how close or how distant you become, or the country has become from, control by Moscow. Are you a puppet? And this is really an underlying theme now that's being generated, in Ukraine, and the idea of democratization and more interest and collaboration, and wanting to have interaction with the West. Okay, so now this is also becoming a threat. But in the meantime, Ukraine ended up being, in 1991, in August, one day, it becomes the third largest nuclear power in the world, because with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Ukraine had all the warheads still on their territory.
Really?
So yeah. So same with Kazakhstan, same with a lot, so with the Soviet Union, when they had their military might and all the nuclear weapons, that was all throughout the Soviet Union, including all the, all the captive states, so to speak.
I guess geographically, it would make sense to have those closer to Europe, potentially, if that's like right, in the sense of like putting them in that spot seems to be more regionally accessible. So yeah. Oh wow. Yeah. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So did Ukraine have to give those back then? Is that was there a process for? Yeah. Sorry. Yes. Go ahead. Maybe I'm cutting in early. Sorry.
No. This is okay. You're following you're following the script here. So yeah. So now you have a country that's essentially the largest the third largest nuclear power, and then there was this agreement that happened like 1994. So in 1994 there was an agreement where this was part of the nuclear disarmament plan for the world, right? So the US, Russia, England as well. They were all really pushing for Ukraine and any of the other nations, outside of Russia that had nuclear weapons, is to, dismantle their nukes. And that ended up occurring because of a 1994 agreement between the countries that allowed that Ukraine basically agreed to dismantle its nuclear weapons, as long as the U.S., Russia, everybody helps helps pay for that, because that's you just don't kind of throw them in a trash, put them out in or bury them or something like that. You have to take them apart, and you have to make sure that the uranium and everything gets gets processed appropriately, and so on and so forth. But you have this agreement, and the other the other request or in this agreement, there was also an assurance that if one of the another country would come in and try to take over, invade, or rule over Ukraine, the parties to this agreement would come to Ukraine's defense.
Oh, really?
So now this was technically it was an assurance. It wasn't actually a guarantee, which would imply military response, and it wasn't a treaty. A treaty, if it was a treaty, treaties, the U.S. cannot enter a treaty unless it's approved by Congress. So it wasn't at that level. So to this day, that every time in 2014, when Putin came in and invaded, took over Crimea, and started to destabilize the eastern provinces in Ukraine as well. I mean, that was a violation of this agreement, same as it is now. However, who came to the rescue? Well, Russia was the one that was doing it. Well, Russia's not going to come to the rescue. What about the U.S.? The U.S. really, didn't come to any military rescue or provide troops or anything, which the Ukrainians were, hoping that would be just as it is now. They want a no-fly zone. They want, NATO to come in and everything like that. This agreement from '94 only provided assurances. So, I mean, the U.S., and this was when, Obama was in, this is in 2014 now, when, Russia invaded Crimea, and started the war in southeast provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk. We provided some military, weaponry. We always hear about, Obama provided blankets and supplies and humanitarian relief and things like that. But, it was always kind of a bad taste in a lot of from the Ukrainian perspective, that, considering that there was an agreement, nobody came to their defense.
So just so I understand, America and other countries made an agreement in 1994 that, hey, we're going to help you dismantle these weapons. Obviously, part of dismantling these weapons is that you aren't going to have the trump card of nuclear weapons response, right? Which I think, to be honest, is the only reason a lot of people aren't more involved in this issue right now, is because we know Russia has nuclear weapons. Like that's the hesitation to get involved here. Obviously, World War III could start without nuclear weapons, but I guess what I'm saying is, and the cost would be catastrophic. Remove nuclear weapons off the board, and it would still be a catastrophic cost. But obviously, nuclear weapons is something that, let me put it this way, it gets put into the equation, right? When we're thinking about a no-fly zone, that seems to be what maybe America's motivations are for not creating that, or NATO's, motivations are. But what you're telling me is in 1994, 20 years prior to 2014, we had an agreement that, hey, we're gonna in essence remove these defenses from you, or at least these things that make people, second guess whether or not they want to invade a place, and in doing that, we're in essence creating a handshake agreement that we got your back if something happens. And a lot of Ukrainians would say Americans have failed at that handshake agreement. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, exactly. Because it's actually, so it's called it's a memorandum of understanding. So it's something like a memorandum of security assurances or something, but it's more known as the Budapest Agreement, 1994 Budapest Agreement.
Okay.
And so that's that's where US, UK, and Russia provided assurances to protect Ukraine's territorial integrity, essentially.
Yeah. And obviously Russia's one of the ones that made that agreement, and they're going back on that quite obviously. So what when we look back to 2014, what ended that? Like, what made that come to an end? What was the agreement either between Ukraine and Russia or all the parties involved that allowed for that tension to stop, or at least be for peace to kind of come, or did it? I guess that's what I was.
Okay, good. Yeah, the ending part is the operative word, or did it?
Yeah,
it never really did, because we essentially look at the 2014 invasion by Putin with taking over Crimea and destabilizing they call them oblasts, but they're basically like provinces or states within Ukraine. So we say Luhansk and Donetsk, that's in the eastern part of Ukraine.
And those border Russia, just so people who geographically don't understand, those border Russia. So it wasn't very hard for them to, in essence, just go in and redraw lines, kind of, or take those. Not that it wasn't hard, but I guess I'm saying, like, geographically, it kind of made sense when they took that portion.
Lines weren't redrawn at that point, but they could easily come across the border and supply rebels, basically, with equipment and supplies to keep the place unstable. And the reason why, one reason, from Putin's perspective, why you would want to keep these provinces destabilized or unstable or very Russified or just in war-torn situation, is that this is a time, and this has been a time since 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, where there's always been this underlying force or underlying idea to eventually maybe joining the West more and more, and to form more and more ties with the West, possibly joining the EU, possibly joining NATO, the European Union. And this was actually one of the triggers, or that's considered one of the triggers of the 2014 invasion, where now you have a situation where more and more people are in favor of joining the European Union. And this again triggered Moscow, or Putin in particular, to say, oh, we can't have that, because this is Ukraine on our border, and we don't want to have another democratic society on our border and basically threatening Russia's kind of politics and economy and everything like that. They don't want to lose control, so they want to keep Ukraine as a buffer between between itself and the Western world. And this is basically and also a big underlying theme going forward for everything that Putin's doing and everything that he says he's doing, and the reasons why he's doing this. And so in 2014, when they came over, this was basically the first warning, or not a warning, but it was actual invasion and the start of a war in Ukraine, to prevent Ukraine from formalizing any ties with the European Union. Because one thing, in order for the country to join the European Union, for instance, you need to have unanimous agreement by all the different oblasts, or all the different provinces within Ukraine. So if you keep a couple provinces destabilized, or rebel rousing, and basically under some threat or actual war, you're never going to have an agreement by the entire country to join the EU. So that alone is mission accomplished. And so you won't have, the formalized tie of Ukraine with the European Union. And that was one of the big, issues that, kind of seemed to force Putin's hand, or at least from his perspective, and which essentially, let's go back to 1960s Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, random, right? But basically, this is when our administration, JF Kennedy, basically told the Soviets, we will not have you interfering with our democracies in the Western Hemisphere. Stay out of the Western Hemisphere. No nukes, no missiles, get the hell out, or we're going to do something. There's going to be a nuclear, nuclear issue going on here. And this was essentially, the Monroe Doctrine that we were doing, in the 1960s. In a sense, this is kind of a similar, issue of, Putin using his kind of concept of a Monroe Doctrine to make sure that, the West is not invading Russia's sphere of influence, and keeping this kind of buffer. In addition to Putin's, megalomaniac, kind of maniacal, attitude of always wanting to reassemble the Soviet Union, which he always considered that one of the biggest humiliations of USSR, of the Soviet Union. He was always, upset that Gorbachev didn't kill millions in order to maintain power and maintain the Union together. So this kind of gets you into a little mindset of Putin, how far he's willing to go. I mean, the guy is he's basically a mid-level KGB thug. I mean, that's the way he's best described. And Masha Gesser had a book, probably a decade close to now, basically on Putin. And really, the theme throughout the book is he's not that brilliant. He's a good strategist. He's a KGB spy, but he's been always mid-level. But then eventually comes to power in 1999. Worked his way through and took over after Yeltsin appointed him as prime minister, and a day later Yeltsin resigns, and now you have Putin, the president of Russia, just like a couple months after the Kosovo War, which he actually had a big strategic part of in supporting, the Serbs. And even trying to flex his muscle by bombing by the Russians bombing one of the airports in Yugoslavia at the time. So this is a complex geopolitical issue. But one thing, just to give you again this mindset of Putin, and actually Xi Jinping in China. We're in the 21st century, right? But we're really dealing with, when we're dealing with Putin, when you're dealing with Xi Jinping, you're dealing with 19th century or 20th century mentality, where they're always thinking about balance of power. Everything that they do is regarding balance of power. Here, that's different than what the West is thinking. The West is getting more into, democracy, of course, but also thinking more global, the globalistic approach and globalistic geopolitical, structures, and I think this is one reason why a lot of people, a lot of analysts, a lot of administrators and all the administrations, why they really can't get a head around why the hell these people, between China and Russia, why they're doing what they're doing. They don't understand, but you really have to think back to, you're only as strong as your might is projected. And if there isn't anybody to push back, that might, they'll just keep spreading, essentially like a plague. And this has been Russia's playbook since the Ivan the Terribles back in the 1500s. There's a there's also a couple of good books. One by this one gentleman, Lev Dobryansky, who was instrumental in creating this charter for captive nations back in the 60s. But he wrote an interesting book, and so it's called The Vulnerable Russians. And essentially it chronicles, kind of the activity, not just military might, but, kind of the mindset, the propaganda of the Russians. And it's constantly, it's like, if you don't push back, they'll just keep coming, and they won't stop until they reach their limit, which is some kind of force. Now, this is all becomes tricky, as you already just raised. It's like, well, now we have people with nuclear weapons. We don't have Ukraine with nuclear weapons, because that's a different thing. But now you have somebody that's threatening technical nuclear weapons, thermobaric bombings, cluster bombing, vacuum bombings, all this kind of stuff. And how far is somebody willing to go? And now it's is it a game of chicken? Is chess being played? How does how do the Russians, how does Putin look at the West? Does he consider them vulnerable right now and not powerful? I mean, one thing that is happening is you're getting a lot of consolidation and unification of NATO, EU, and a lot of world nations in the West because of this. So is this a backfire at the same time?
In a lot of ways, I'm kind of like, I mean, to get a little political here, Putin has kind of always been a bad guy, at least in an American general mindset. You know what I mean? And obviously, I would assume Ukrainians feel, not maybe everyone, but because there's never any complete, unanimous thought on somebody. But I guess what I'm saying is, like, I would assume Ukraine's always felt some kind of way about Russia, at least as you just go through the history. You're not necessarily friendly, which is very interesting in the sense that you have Russians who live there in Ukraine, or have and living at peace with people after the Russification, like you said, like that. I'm sure that has created some internal problems of thought, of Western ideas being challenged within Ukraine. But in America, we've kind of always had, at least ever since I remember, Putin's like a bad guy. And then yet over the last kind of 5 years, that kind of thought changed, or at least from some political leaders, it shifted. Let me put it that way. That I wonder how much that plays into this too, in the sense that the West hasn't been as maybe vocally strong about our position on Putin or Russia. But then also you say the Western kind of coming into Ukraine, you're talking about thoughts, ideas, philosophies on democracy and all of that, and it's so hard because I feel like Putin's in a position where it's like, dude, you can't control the internet. I'm getting so much news about Ukraine from Instagram, bro. You can't stop someone with a phone who's going to post this. You can't control this. Like, there is no controlling this. And your invasion has solidified the world on Ukraine's side, man. I didn't know about this nearly as much as I know in the last 3 weeks. And I mean, I think I remember it in 2014, but it didn't seem as globally, as much of a global touch point as it is right now. Would it be fair to say there's a much larger scale right now than what they did in 2014, correct?
Yes, yeah, definitely. Because, like nobody really predicted, well, when you look at all the analysts, everybody, like Ukrainians, we'll talk about that in a second. They didn't predict that Putin was going to come across the border all through he's been building up, his military, of 100,000 and more military personnel along the eastern border, and then Belarus, and the northern border, of Ukraine. And essentially everybody thought, or the general school of thought, I should say, was that, all right, he's showing his might at the border. again, he's flexing because he doesn't want, now the discussion is about joining NATO, not just joining EU. Now it's like a bigger thing, which means, if you join NATO and you get invaded, then that triggers what they call Article 5, which is essentially authorizes a military response to protect, the country being invaded. But thought, okay, there's some negotiations here, and all right, we'll stop there. We'll come to the table, and somebody will do something, and it'll say, okay, NATO, okay, Ukraine isn't going to join NATO. So in a sense, again, Ukraine is being used as a pawn in this to keep this buffer zone. And the thing is that when you look at, again, Ukraine as a buffer, one of the schools of thought, which hasn't been very popular, is that Putin's responses are in response to the West's attack on Russia. Okay, how is that? This is and this this is part of a bigger a hybrid war that Putin is using in this information / misinformation / gaslighting aspect of justifying what they want to do in order to for you to respond and get you to do what they want you to do. Okay, this actually is part, the Soviet theorists from the 50s and 60s established something called the Soviet doctrine of reflexive control. Okay, so this essentially is accuse somebody of something, okay, that is preposterous, all right, and then say, well, I'm just responding to to what you're doing because you're doing something bad. It's not me doing something bad. I'm just responding to it. So I'm reacting to this, but you started it. And this is kind of the idea. What's happened with the reason why Putin came over the first time as well, in 2014. Is
this even part of like him saying like, I'm going into Ukraine because we need to denazify Ukraine? Is that like
yes.
that's a great example, right, of exactly what you're saying? Like, this isn't a problem, but you're pretending it's a problem, and because you control the propaganda within Russia and the media outlets within Russia, you can say that, and it's not going to be challenged necessarily by your base. The world might know, but your base is going to struggle to maybe sift through the information. Is that the fair way of kind of saying that?
That's exactly right. This is the same thing and then they're going to be peacekeepers on top of that.
Oh yeah.
We'll come in as peacekeepers to make sure that nobody is, nobody's acting like a Nazi because the Jewish president of Ukraine, Zelensky, okay, but this is, again, the playbook is the same what they used in Georgia years before that, where they basically invaded Georgia under the auspices of saying we need to protect our Russian citizens in the state of Georgia, the country of Georgia, because they're being attacked by local Georgians, Ossetians, and stuff, and Chechens, and all this kind of stuff. So we're going to go in there and we're going to respond. We're not the aggressors here. We're just defending our people that live there. And this is the same thing. We're going to denazify that, and there's a genocide being waged by the Ukrainians in the provinces of Luhansk and Donetsk on the eastern border of Ukraine with Russia. So we're going to come in there and be the peacekeeper. But this is kind of the thinking, and it's exactly the way you said. It's a playbook that's played over and over again, and just every time it's been getting on a larger scale. They did something in Kazakhstan, they did this in Georgia, and now they're doing this in Ukraine, and it may go further into the Balkans or whatever if it keeps going from there.
So you mentioned Zelensky, President Zelensky. Dude seems like a pretty amazing leader, just from like, I don't know anything about him until the last, like I said, couple weeks. But like,
Yeah.
America's like, we'll get you a ride out. He's like, I don't need a ride. he's
Yeah,
like,
I just need ammo.
I just need ammo, man. Don't give me a ride. I mean, you can just see, even when like I've listened to a lot of his speeches translated in English, and like he speaks very well. I mean, I heard he used to be a comedian but I'm like,
Yeah.
he speaks
Yeah.
very well. He seems to be very articulate. He seems to have a very Western mindset, or at least bringing Russia or Ukraine into the 21st century. Not that, you know, other leaders hadn't done that, but it seems like he is the right leader to bring them into a global like into something like the EU or into something like
Mhm.
NATO. He seems to have an expansive kind of worldview. How is he received in Ukraine? Like even prior to this, has he been like a 50-50 kind of leader, or has he been more of like a landslide leader that a lot of the people are behind, or maybe explain a little bit of like, even I would assume this move by Putin has almost solidified even his, I don't know what his standing was prior to this, but it would seem like probably a lot of Ukrainians, if they weren't for him, have seen his courage and his willingness to stand up to Putin, and like have seen that as like a maybe, I don't know the politics of the inside, but it seems like he'd be a hard leader not to follow, or at least be like, I got to respect this guy. Like I at least from afar, that's how I'm seeing it. How are Ukrainians
Yeah.
inside Ukraine seeing this?
Yeah. Well, first of all, yeah, you said it. Yeah, a lot of what you said is true. But yeah, as far as right now, currently, he definitely is the man of the moment. All
Yeah.
right, he is the guy, and he's showing, you know, the resilience of the Ukrainians, and he's, you know, he's playing it right, and he's unifying, you know, Ukraine and the rest of the world, basically, based on everything that he's doing, to the extent that he can, what he can do. So he's, you know, he's in his I think mid-40s now. He was born in, you know, southern part of Ukraine, or Russian speaking. And then he first went to law school. So he, you know, he has a law degree. And then I'm not sure exactly how much law he actually practiced, but at some point he decided to get into comedy and TV. And interestingly enough, that as he was developing his craft, you know, from this actor comedian side, he ended up playing the role of the Ukrainian president in a parody, you know, of a parody comedy show, and became popular that way. So you know, he knows the camera, he
Yeah.
understands media, so
He was
can
the
do things.
voice. He was the voice of Paddington in Ukrainian, right? That's what I heard.
I think
He was the voice of
yeah,
Paddington. I was like, that's
I,
hilarious. Little kids are growing up with his voice as the bear that they're watching on Paddington. I'm like, that's wild.
yeah, yeah. But yeah, so then he decided, you know, at some point to go, you know, I guess to go, you know, to get into politics. And this was a time when, you know, you have this this guy. Yeah, we've had a number, or Ukraine has had a number of presidents, and the one president, Viktor Yanukovych, was president in Ukraine in the early 2000s, and you know, he was very much a Russophile and more of a Putin puppet, and you know, with all the trimmings and corruption that goes with that. And when he came up for election, he was going up against another candidate called Yushchenko, and this occurred in back in like 20 or 04 or so. And what happened was that, and we'll get to Zelensky, but
Yeah, no, this is good, because I haven't really understood the politics of the 21st century in general. So this is helpful. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So what happened was you know, Yanukovych was you know, up for election against this guy Yushchenko, who was much more, you know, democratic, and during the election process, what happened was it turned out that Viktor Yushchenko was kind of pulling ahead in the polls of this Yanukovych. And it just became so obvious that Yanukovych was president at that time. But because the polling became so strong, Yanukovych basically shut down the media, and the next day declared himself the winner. Okay, so
very Putin move, very Putin type move. Yeah.
Exactly. And so what would happen? Well, the people get pissed off.
Yeah.
Right. And what happened was the beginning of the Orange Revolution. So this was just because of what was going on was also worldwide, being looked at under the lens by the rest of the world. There was political pressure, internal, international, such that the government, in the Rada, the government basically, had to hold a revote. And this time, Yushchenko was elected. And so he, so he beat out Yanukovych, the Russian puppet. And this was, it was a great thing. He was, moving forward with the presidency, but, it was difficult and still had to deal with a lot of corruption. And after 5 years, he actually lost to Yanukovych again. So Yanukovych, came back into power.
Swings back, yeah.
And things swing back and it begins to turn Ukraine back into a puppet state of Russia. So it's taken over societal controls, infiltrating police, military, Russian nationals, and nationalism was permeating through. And so it was, it really put a damper on, the democratic state, moving forward. But eventually, you're going into 2013, and I promise you, we'll get back into Zelensky.
No, it's fine. Yeah. No, this is good.
Yes, and so we're coming back into 2013 and starting to get ready for for the next series of elections and things, and an underlying kind of effort was being made to try to get Ukraine in some kind of a plan or stepwise integration over time back into the European Union and maybe even NATO. Okay, now where are they getting this from? Well, back in 2008, there was a NATO Bucharest summit, and it was about countries, who's deserving to get into NATO, where are we going, where we are, and everything, kind of like a strategic plan and everything. But in there was a really interesting, statement that they ended up putting into, as far as it became a pledge. And the proponent of this statement was the German chancellor at the time, Angela Merkel. And she actually put into a statement, and this was debated back and forth, but she eventually, this is a NATO directive, or not directive, but part of a summit, and she put in this statement that said eventually, pledging that Georgia and Ukraine will become members of NATO, but no time frames or anything were articulated or anything, and this, of course, Putin blows a vessel over this, and this is simmering for a while, and this is kind of like, no, we can't do this, so there was this democratic move by the parliament, the Rada, to try to keep moving in this direction. So there were all these undertones going on. And this was also while Yanukovych was president. And again, this is the Russian puppet, and he didn't like this. So at one point, he just announced that Ukraine would suspend this activity. We're done. No, we're having no more of this talk, and instead that Ukraine will join the Russian Commonwealth of Independent States, or the Eurasian Customs Union, or something like that. So it's basically doing a 180 right away. And so, and not only that, but at the time when this was all happening, Viktor Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine, flies to Moscow to consult with Putin on this. So you can't get more of a puppet tie to Russia and the Ukrainian president at the time. So so then what happened was, then Yanukovych, he gets the security and everything to attack protesters in Kyiv because everybody's starting to revolt. And just because of this kind of like, we'll have no more talk of democracy or joining the European Union or NATO, this ended up turning into what's known as the Euromaidan. So this is like the revolution of consciousness.
Is this 2013? 2013?
This is in 2013. Yeah.
Okay.
So
it puts in context. It puts in context why Putin would come in 2014. Like the fact that this is all happening the year prior. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. So and Putin's looking at this and he's accusing Ukraine of being taken over by extremists. So now you have, and then what happened? Because the uprising. I mean, there's nobody actually died right away, and so that's what 2013. By 2014, there was such an eruption and protests all over Ukraine that Yanukovych eventually fled. Fled and disappeared essentially. So beginning February 2014 is when the first deaths actually did occur during this Euromaidan. So you kind of remember, this is before the invasion, before the war started essentially by Putin, that nobody was, the Yanukovych and that military started shooting people. I mean, over 100 people were killed over a few days. And these martyrs of the revolution, from this Euromaidan, are called the Nebesna Sotnya, which is the celestial 100. Yeah, so they're known that. So now this is in 2014. Now, and you have all these protests because we're not going to be democratic. Ukraine isn't going to be democratic. And you got all this, people are being killed. The world is watching, and there's all these other agreements and things like that. But basically, Yanukovych ends up, fleeing for Russia. And then, the Ukrainian parliament has to elect new leadership that May, and they ended up electing, Willy Wonka and the chocolate factory owner, the Peter Poroshenko, okay, because he was a chocolate manufacturer magnate.
Okay.
Magnate. So that's why we're kind things like Willy Wonka and all that kind of stuff. But
your guys' politics, your guys' politics in Ukraine are about as interesting as ours over here. This is interesting. A chocolate factory owner.
Yeah, we have chocolate magnates. We have comedians. Of course, we could argue we have plenty of comedians in our government.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah. So, but from this, so we're starting to get this, and now you see why, Putin is really kind of getting all upset over this, freaking out, blowing vessels left and right. That we're gonna lose. Russia is gonna lose Ukraine as a sphere of influence because they want to go democratic. And they just ousted essentially their leader, which was my right-hand man in Ukraine. So he invades the Crimean Peninsula and decides to take that over. Crimean Peninsula was actually given to Ukraine as a territory by Nikita Khrushchev in 1953. as a way to placate, other uprisings and in politics in Ukraine. So Crimea wasn't always part of Ukraine. It's kind of gone back and forth, but it became officially a territory or state or a possession of Ukraine, or part of Ukraine, essentially, just shortly after the war by Nikita Khrushchev. Well, of course, Putin never liked that one either.
Yeah.
So basically, Putin doesn't like anything that doesn't involve reestablishing, power, solidifying and centralizing power in the old, as the old Soviet Union.
He's losing influence. He's losing power, and he responds by asserting his power and dominance, is what it seems like. That it seems to be a reoccurring theme that, like,
it's all balance of of power politics. And it's a matter of, who can you control and what can you control? It's not, can we get along and can we make a deal? It's mine, it's my ball, I'm taking it, or you can't have it, or I'm going to blow you up type of, attitude.
So how long does the chocolate factory guy stay in power? How long does he make it?
For a few years.
Yeah.
For a few years, till 2019.
Okay.
But so now you have this war going on, in eastern Ukraine. Essentially, it's a war. You could call it a military operation, as Putin would call it, or actually he never admitted. Okay, so that's actually a critical point. Even if you remember during the the initial invasion in 2014 of the Crimean Peninsula. If you remembered some news reports that a lot of the invaders or occupiers did not have country insignia on their uniforms. They essentially were little green men. Okay, and these were Russians.
Yeah.
And so this gives, this eventually allows, this
plausible deniability. I didn't have my look.
Like so egregiously implausible.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Everybody knows what the F is going on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But he's playing this. Oh, I don't know who's doing this, and we're not doing anything in eastern Ukrainian provinces. Those are local uprisings. I can't help it if they want to do, but we're happy to protect them if necessary. So again, this is playing that that reflex control doctrine and all this gaslighting stuff. It's like, all right, but. So go forward to 2015, about a year later or so, and there's going to be a ceasefire agreement. Okay, this sounds very interesting. So it's called the Minsk Agreement. So a bunch of people from Russia, Ukraine, Germany, French go up to Minsk in Belarus. And trying to seek peace, essentially, in areas of Ukraine that were taken over by these pro-Russian separatists the year before. Okay, so this is again that Donbass region and the Luhansk region that are being occupied, and the idea is to get get some kind of a peace agreement, or at least a ceasefire, and they're able to agree on a ceasefire. All right, and remember, Russia is involved in this. Nowhere in this agreement is there any indication that Russia is even named in the agreement, or that Russia is an aggressor. But yet Russia is in there as a clause that can be a mediator of the war. All right. So again, this comes back from these little green men that have no country insignia, and Russia is not admitting to anything, but they're happy to protect, or it will mediate the any problems that occur in that area. So I mean, wolf and hen house and all these kind of metaphors that that you can say. It's just bizarre that it's kind of a meaningless agreement in a sense, because there's this I heard, the other day or previously this, this joke, what do you call when two nations, send in troops, tanks, armaments, and and military, ordnance, against each other, and they call it a ceasefire. This was what the essentially the ceasefire mounted out to be. And so,
and that's happening now. That's happening right now, where they're agreeing to these ceasefires, and then all of a sudden there's not a ceasefire, and you're seeing people that are trying to evacuate get gunned down in the middle of what was supposed to be a ceasefire. I mean, so this is not the same playbooks being played right now, even.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so what started in 2014 has never really finished. Okay. So you have
it just de-escalated. It just de-escalated a little bit.
It just kind of saying it. Well, yeah. It just stayed kind of local.
Okay.
If you stayed to those eastern provinces, eastern oblasts of Luhansk and Donetsk, kind of already, Crimea was taken over. All right. That's the end of that. But there's constantly this, Russia supplying these, these pro-Russian, separatists, just to keep it going. And we're talking, 14,000 people died in that, in the initial part of that war. I mean, this is not, just a skirmish.
Yeah.
Or so. But it's just as you say, as you observed. It's that same kind of playbook. We're always responding to something. We're never the aggressor. We have all this kind of, deniability of ever being involved in everything. And it's just, the West is being very diplomatic all the time. Nobody really calls them out, and nobody really puts up a strong resistance from the West. Sanctions are more. They put some sanctions before, but, which is a whole other thing. But what happened is in 2019, you have a comedian that wants to become president. And so he ends up, Poroshenko is out, there's always this underveiling, issues of corruption, what can be done. And there's all these, parties and a lot of, Russian or pro-Russian subversion in the government and so on. And it's, just really difficult to weed all this out. And Poroshenko, the chocolate factory guy, was trying to do that. He's probably not without sin either, in all this, to the extent that, that he tried. He had a democratic approach and was pushing that. But still, he kind of lost favor with the populace. And now you have, Zelensky that throws his hat in the ring. His party was named the same name that the party in his comedy show was. So it's you can't make this stuff up.
So I would assume there's a part of it that's like, hey, we could throw a Molotov cocktail into this because this guy is a wild card. We don't know what we're gonna get in some ways, right? Like, but we're probably not gonna get like a Putin figurehead out of it. Is that kind of what was being thought?
Right. Yeah. So his line, he ran on the line of, anti-corruption, and he's been pretty good with that. Kind of consistent. So he did get elected with I think it was 73% of the.
Wow.
Quite a high amount.
Okay.
But in overtime, so he started out good, but then of course you get dips and in the popularity, and because you just can't change the country's path, or internal politics don't change on a dime just because
it's also been a hard season, I would assume. Becoming a president of a country in 2019, the next year, early on in the next year, you've got COVID. And you've got that changes everything. Economics, everything just gets challenged there. So I would assume it hasn't been the easiest of problems that he's had to solve on top of the problems that were already pressing when he stepped in.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so he had his critics, saying that, for one, it's like, you can't do anything. Well, that's not surprising because you have absolutely no experience in politics.
Yeah.
Okay. Point taken.
Yeah.
But also, certain things couldn't be done, so he'd start falling out of favor with some people, and it kind of, wax and wane. And like you said, you have COVID, in the mix of things, and you have, struggling, economy, struggling world, and everything. But slowly you start getting into, his favorability rating was down at, I think, 25% at one time,
Oh, wow.
just before this invasion broke out. So
Wow.
it hasn't been all, all glory and, and 5-star ratings and everything. And part of that was he's critics also say he's pretty thin-skinned with the media, so he'd kind of lash out at the media. We've seen people do that before, but he's also had some, has shut down some of them here and there. So sometimes, he's saying he's starting to get a little tyrannical. So it hasn't been as smooth as what you see now.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Everything.
That's
So,
interesting.
but
That's interesting to hear the origin of like the presidents to now in the 21st century, because that's got to be so challenging to step in as a president. I just think, well, first of all, to step in as a president period of any institution or country, like that's super challenging. But then like in this particular case, his detractors internally in Ukraine have Russian background or are pro-Russia, but they're living in Ukraine. And so he has this a population that he has to kind of appease, right? Or at least keep satisfied.
right.
So like the more Western he goes, while that might seem like a very popular thing to me as a Westerner, obviously, there's probably a good amount of his own country that's struggling with that concept or struggling with that direction. And in the era of misinformation and just
Right.
slander, he's got to work through his own ways of creating propaganda / talking points that can keep everybody on the same page, which is got to be so hard when you have a country with that much of a history of going just kind of pendulum back and forth. And so in
Right.
a lot of ways, Putin's kind of solidified him as, would you say Putin solidified him in a lot of ways as a leader of more honor and dignity and integrity than he previously had even before this?
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Shocking.
Indeed.
Shocking.
Yeah. Yeah. Because even because you're talking about again, excuse me. We talk about the East-West divide of Ukraine, and historical polling, over the past, since 2014, let's say, it's like easy to see because you can see the East would go one way and the West would go the other way, Western part of Ukraine versus Eastern part of Ukraine. But now, if you do, well, now if you're invading Ukraine, you're invading all of Ukraine. And now what you've done is pretty much unify, because you have, first of all, why the hell are you invading? What's the purpose? What's your end game?
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. What do you think Putin's end game is? Because I guess
if
stabilizing the country is the end game. You could argue if he just left right now, he created a lot of instability. He created a ton of refugees. Are they going to come back? And then also just the amount of infrastructure that's been damaged just during this war already. But that doesn't seem to be his end game, is just destabilization. It seems to be destabilization and a certain percentage of control amid the destabilization, which you've referenced multiple times. What do you think that level of control or power, or like, what do you think he's thinking as he's reassembling? I mean, maybe you don't know, but I guess theories about that, about what he's trying to do.
I'm bad at predicting because I predicted he wouldn't cross the border either. But be that as it may, because I mean, you can invade a country. You have Ukrainian, resistance that is, amazing right now. I mean, considering you have a military might like Russia that should be able to come in and just annihilate you.
Listen, Ukraine ain't nothing to mess with. Like, that's what we found out right now, right? I mean, I saw a dude with a mine in his hand while smoking a cigarette just walking it like it was no big deal. I'm like, look, they're not leaving.
Yeah.
Like they're not going. Like this is not normal. I guess I'm
Yeah.
like,
I know. Well, the best one, the best form of resistance, and Ukrainians or people of Ukrainian descent know this very well, is when the grandmother took out a drone with a pickle jar.
Maybe that's what I was. Yeah, the drone with a pickle jar. Yeah, I was like, are you kidding me? We got grandmas out here. Like this is not this. Y'all did not know what you were getting into. That I mean, there's a certain level of humor to it in the sense of like, clearly Russia did not even know what they were going to experience from like the intelligence or the planning was really poor. At the same time, you don't want to laugh about it because you're also recognizing that like thousands of people are suffering and dying because they are so greatly overwhelmed from just a technology weaponry situation. So it's like the end game of what Putin's trying to do, whatever that is, in a lot of ways, time's going to win out for him because he does have the military ability to get there eventually. And that's where I wonder what the US should be doing differently. But I guess those two questions of like, what do you think Putin's end game is? And then what do you think the US or, NATO should be doing more of, or, allies should be doing more of?
Yeah, I think, Putin's end game is really hard because like we're discussing, you have the military might to just wipe out the entire country, 44 million people. You can do whatever you want. You can start launching cruise missiles, everywhere, and you can do shock and awe type of stuff. The initial wave, I mean, first of all, bordered, he came in from the north, from the east, and from the south. And when you look at the way the military was structured on those borders, they weren't very well organized from a military perspective. It was kind of a mix and match. Logistics were terrible, but the thinking here, the common thinking was that Putin underestimated the Ukrainians. First of all, you think that they would come in, the first wave would come in and they would just lay down or roll over, and he can install his puppet government and move in, because he didn't go after the the airports right away. You think you go after the airports, but it seemed like he was going to preserve the airports and just try to take them over, because then you could get air supremacy. That didn't seem to work out either. It just seems as though either he got bad military advice, which I can't believe the generals would do that, or he just decided this is what I'm going to do, and that's it.
His arrogance might have got the best of him, of thinking we can handle this, no problem, Nick. Yeah,
we've seen that since the time of Caesar.
Exactly.
In the wars, the hubris and all that. But so then you come in with the second wave, and you start surrounding the cities and trying to come in, and do you annihilate them? I mean, you're bombing civilian condos, hospitals, schools. Kids are being killed. People all over are being terrorized, obviously. But just don't understand the reason, because again, you could come in, invade, and win a war, but you're not going to keep that, because you're going to get insurgency. Okay, that's going to continue. You're going to end up in this Afghanistan scenario, Russian Afghanistan in the 80s. It's just something that's going to keep gnawing on you. And so are you willing to annihilate millions of people and expect nobody to do anything? So now say, what is the response by others? Is Putin just going to stop at Ukraine, or is he going to continue into Moldova, Romania, Poland, the Baltic states? Where do you want to go first? Now these are NATO countries, so this is a whole, this is a whole different ball game. So
if he makes that jump, that's got to be World War III, right? I mean, I'm not trying to like call that. I mean, a lot of people are saying that, and I wouldn't say we're there yet, but I guess what I'm saying is like, I feel like if he steps into that, we're gonna
if he's into that shit, then that's all hell is gonna break loose. Because I mean, different, if you read different analysts from, you could say the beginning of World War III may have started in 2014, and it's continuing now. And it's now we just reached another inflection point. And is there going to be another inflection point?
Yeah, because it's interesting. It's interesting to look back at World War II and realize that you had like this constant call for America to get involved, and you saw us kind of waiting. We weren't really calling it World War II at that time. We weren't really seeing it as this global touch point, right, of everybody interconnected in this conflict that was happening, that was at the time relatively regional, right? And so, but it became that really fast. And I think I think we're seeing a spark and potential gasoline that could make that same kind of like quick switch. And hopefully we've learned not to stay out of it for so long, because it seemed, you could argue, like part of what prolonged World War II and at least Hitler's like influence and power was the lack of stopping it before more power was granted, I guess, or attained. I mean, I'm not a World War II historian. I'm sure someone could tell me that's not the reason, but I guess what I'm saying is, like, it did seem like there was let's wait, let's try not to escalate things by responding. Let's not send our own people to go fight a war that's not our own. We as Americans have a good job of, we do a good job of getting into conflicts that are really, and a lot of times, none of our business, or aren't necessarily have our best interest. But this seems like one that, like, just from the surface is like, what do you think America should be doing beyond sanctions? Should we support something like a no-fly zone?
Well, this is like the tinderbox scenario here, because because all you need is for one Yahoo or some inadvertent interaction. I mean, they could be flying by next to each other or something in the air, and accidentally hit each other or something. You could have somebody fire on somebody, and then that just goes from there.
You could even have this. You could even have Putin like create a false flag of something that didn't even happen, that he blames on America, that because he wants to prove that what they're like. That's the problem. When we get involved, the propaganda of it also can be used against us. Would be the way, like
the same way he was like, we need to denazify. We need to stop the Ukrainian genocide of Russians in those eastern provinces. But and it's like right now, the fog of war news, right? You don't know what's real a lot of times. We see the ghosts of Kyiv, the this, the that, is this true or not? Or it's interesting. Yeah, it's great for morale. It's this, but Russian propaganda is the opposite. So we see a lot of terrible things, from that side. No fly zone. I'm very, very hesitant about a no-fly zone, just because it seems like it would be such a quick trigger for something to happen. What U.S. and the West is doing now, and I mean, we're talking Germany now has turned around. We have Portugal helping. You have a lot of countries. Italy is on board, and of course Poland and so on. Poland wants to supply some MiGs for the Ukrainians, and a lot of the armamentarium, military ordnance, and everything. Well, realistically, a lot of this is all U.S. one way or the other. Whether
what I heard was Poland's going to supply some things, and including aircrafts, and then we are going to backfill Poland's aircrafts. In essence, we're not going to supply Ukraine the aircrafts. Poland supplies Ukraine the aircraft, so we're not, and then we'll backfill. And it's like, okay, like whatever. I mean, I guess that works.
Poland is brand new stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Poland's like, upgrade. Okay. Yeah. I think it's interesting, the kind of like chess of it all, of like sanctions, financial, all of that, and the impacts that's having. And then like what the, because I don't know that we have any way of escalating beyond potentially being in a tinderbox situation from where we are right now. Like, I don't know what support we can give beyond these creative ways of providing weaponry that doesn't
Yeah.
potentially create this tinderbox. And if he
Yeah.
keeps going past Ukraine, it's like he's stepped right into the tinderbox at that point. Like
Yeah.
there's no way to avoid it. I don't think. It's very interesting times to see all this happening, and it must be like shocking to you, or maybe not shocking, but like this is your, motherland. Like this is your home.
Yeah.
And we haven't really personalized this too much except at the start with your parents, but like to personalize it, you have probably friends and family there currently, right? Are you in contact with friends and family that are in Ukraine right now?
Yeah. I have some family that's actually they're close to the Polish border, near Lviv, so they actually headed to Poland to visit friends even before the official, before all hell broke loose the other week. So we found that. I'm in constant contact with all my Ukrainian friends. I was just in Rochester over the weekend for a large donation drive of supplies that's going to a lot of the refugee camps and going to Ukraine. Same thing is going on here in Buffalo, New York, and I was Rochester, New York, since you're in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And, yeah, but and everybody has the stories of well, first of all, most of Ukraine did not think that there was going to be an invasion. It's like one of my friend's cousins, just a week before last, they headed out to Paris for like a belated honeymoon, thinking, yeah, everything's fine. We'll just come back. It's all good. Nothing's going to happen. Surprise. But there are many people that are going to the Polish border or the Romanian border now and dropping off their kids. So the moms and the girls and boys, are being dropped off there. The men are staying behind to fight because there is a dictate by Zelensky that anybody from 16 to 80 or 18 to 80, should stay back and help the cause and things. And so we have, story after story after story of people's, cousins, families, kids, in the refugee camps now. Or some of them are able to come, they're already being put on planes, either from Poland or moving on to Germany and coming to the US. But then a lot of them that are coming here already since then say, we don't want, US is nice, but this is our home. We shouldn't be forced to leave our homes, our homeland, the rest of our family. And, this is like, talk about disruption of your life. This is not, oh, it's time to immigrate and move on and, go west, young man type of, approach. This is kind of like, get out or you may die.
Very traumatic. Very traumatic.
Yeah,
this isn't no plan. Wow. So we've talked a lot about a lot of things. What's something that someone listening can actually do? Because one of the things that's very difficult when we look at the world is, and I feel this all the time, I feel so powerless. I just want to curse. There's really it's just like, there's nothing I feel like I can do. And even in this situation, it's so frustrating because, like you said, it's like I can be like, we just need to enforce a no-fly zone, and it's like, well, that might not even help. And so it's like, even like you don't even know what to support sometimes, in the sense of like what solutions even exist. What's something that someone listening can actually do to help? Maybe even some organizations you're aware of, or ways that they can donate, or just anything you think that, obviously most people listening to this American, but anywhere, how they can help.
Yeah, I'll start from the political side. What people can do is, contact your representatives, your Congress, people, your senators, write them, contact them, saying you want them to support Ukraine in any way that you feel they should. From humanitarian aid, on a national level to to military aid as far as supplies. Obviously, we're not talking boots in the ground for the most part. That's pretty much off the table. And so there's that part, but also, not only that, but you have people in the in Europe or in, the United States. I mean, we're talking about, what sanctions can be done, again, from the political side. We're talking about Nord Stream, we're talking about, SWIFT, banking and all that. We haven't talked about China, that's a whole, separate issue. But the thing is that, sanctions at some point will work. Should we get off of gas dependency? And this is, last week, I was very, pleased and surprised to hear the secretary of the president of the EU Council lay out a full plan of the EU to get off of Russian gas and oil. And it was a surprise to hear that. I mean, everybody talks about it. This is what we should do. This is how we should do that. What's going to be the effect? And she's, I believe, a Dutch, a Dutch woman. That's the president of the council, and said, look, we can get through the next couple months through the winter. And then we got to get off of this gas. Germany has to, Italy has to, and if it means, we're trying to get other sources, are you going to go to OPEC? Are you going to go to Iran? These are also questions, where else do you get it? Here in the States, we have the constant controversy and arguments over, let's open up, drilling, drill baby drill, all that, Keystone XL pipeline. And yes, this won't happen overnight, but we have to do something. We do have oil reserves as well. There's a lot of things we can try to do. We could keep doing it. Nothing's going to happen overnight, essentially. But so there's, there are issues on a political side that you can press.
So broadly staying aware politically of how those things are affecting this conflict is what I was saying.
Right. Yeah, gotcha. Yeah. And everybody is experiencing it personally. I mean, go fill up your car. And we could talk about, I mean, it wasn't just, it's been going on for a year or two now. It just didn't happen in the last couple of weeks that this conflict or this war, triggered everything. So there's policies in place, or you don't think they're in place. So there's a political discussion that, it can always get into. But on a personal level, there are organizations, you can do the Red Cross, you can do for all the, the international aid organizations, for humanitarian aid. A lot of the large cities in Philadelphia, New York, Buffalo, New York, Rochester, New York, Chicago, everybody has like a Ukrainian community, and nearly all of those also have at least one, if not more than one, charitable organization that's set up for donations, either monetary or supplies. And many of the monetary donations, many of the charities are primarily, or many of them right now, have a history since 2014 that they've been around because of the initial invasion. Of sending medical supplies and any kind of humanitarian aid, especially now, I mentioned before, the diapers, the sanitary, feminine hygiene products, and so on and so forth, all those. And I know, over the weekend, we put together one shipping container. That's one has gone off, another one should be gone off in the next day or so. So there are many organizations that you could go in, type in humanitarian or Ukraine aid. You'll probably come up with a bunch of organizations, or you may know somebody that can direct you to them. But these are all, you want to make sure that they're verifiable.
That's what I was going to ask. I was going to ask, maybe you can email me some links of some things you would recommend, and I'll put them in the show notes. So if you're listening to this, check the show notes. I'll have some links to some verifiable, like actually will get to the right people and help the right people. I know, every nonprofit has to have a lot of administrative costs and things like that. But I know that some, a very small percentage of what you give actually goes to help, and it's going to a lot of other things. And so you might know of some things that are very, legitimate and aware of what the needs are on the ground, to maybe a little more connected to, Ukrainian heritage, identity, and things like that, to where they kind of understand the conflict better, see, where things
all
can
of
go.
all of these organizations are mainly 501c3, not for profit, tax exempt things, and the monies and everything, and is everything's above board. But like I said, you're confident that either money directly goes toward buying supplies, or or supporting shipping and everything like that to get it there as fast as possible. So I'm happy to send you a number of those.
George, this has been really awesome. We've talked almost 2 hours, and I'm incredibly thankful. I'm incredibly thankful for your time. Is there anything you want to say before signing off? Like, any final thoughts you want to leave with people who are listening or watching?
Sure, I'll say some from what I said. So I'm a scientist. Also, I'll give you a quick little story on going back to who inhabited the lands of Ukraine back 30, 50,000 years ago and stuff. And so there are a lot of people, Trypillian people, and civilizations that were there. But a few years back, 2015, there was a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that did a really good genetic study of remains of people from like 30,000 years ago. And basically they were able to trace the Irish heritage back to originating or coming through Ukraine. So we Ukrainians and Irish have this kind of genetic mix in there, because the settlements there in southern Ukraine were very similar, and that may explain why we like potatoes. We like to sing and dance, and maybe imbibe a little occasionally. But that's just but that's actually a very bona fide study. They're looking at genetic migrations, because a lot of that comes from from Persia and the Iranian subcontinent and so on. So a lot of people come from there. But really, the big thing is to maintain awareness, help where you can. Again, through either personal donations or supporting any kind of relief or governmental things. And of course, you want to pray for the people in Ukraine, because there's a lot of people that are suffering, dying, and will still suffer and pass because of some crazy man that nobody understands really why what's happening is actually happening.
George, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for being on Beyond Boundaries. I think this was I learned a ton today, and I think the listeners learned a bunch. So thank you so much for being on. I'm really praying. Yeah, go ahead.
We also have this trident.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, it's quick. Yeah, because I put it on. That was a jersey I was wearing to the Sabres game yesterday.
That's awesome.
But yeah, so it's a Ukrainian hockey jersey. But the trident is something you see in a lot of places. It's basically the coat of arms, or the symbol of Ukraine. And it is in a sense of in a form of a trident. And it's it's a little more animated and stylized, but that actually has a history back to the late 900s by one of the first by actually one of the first princes that came from the Norsemen and from the Scandinavian countries, and ended up occupying in what became Kievan Rus. And he actually brought Volodymyr Veliki, Volodymyr the Great, actually ended up bringing Christianity to the Ukraine in 988, but he also developed that symbol of Ukraine, and it actually has 4 letters in it, Ukrainian letters in it. It's a V-O-L-A, V, but in Ukrainian it's a B. So it spells out voya, which in Ukrainian means freedom.
Oh, wow.
So that is actually spelled out in that stylized trident. And
That's
so
really cool.
this is what the Ukrainians have been struggling and striving for millennia.
Yeah.
And it's constantly somebody's trying to take over somebody, but that symbol is, you'll tend to see that. And so that's a symbol of freedom for us.
Mm. Well, my prayer and hope is that freedom can be had, and that maybe even each of us can have a part in that, whether that's, again, supporting certain ideas and politics and pressures that need to be placed, or providing relief and help, as I'm sure this is going to be a rebuild project no matter what. Like, there's going to be a lot of need for aid and support. And I'm just super thankful that you came on and took some time out of your busy schedule to share with us about the history and, some of the personal elements of this, and how it connects to so much of what, maybe we're somewhat aware of, but not aware of how it connected to Ukraine. And I think so much of the problems in our world could be solved by having a better understanding of how we got into the problem and the history of it, so that we can see solutions that didn't work and solutions maybe that might work in the future. And so thank you for providing a history lesson for all of us. You started by saying you're not a historian, and then you were just dropping knowledge bombs for 2 hours. Like, so you clearly know your history, but thanks for being on. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed this, Justin.
Hey, thanks for joining us. If you are new to the Belong Collective, if you maybe found us through this conversation, you can go to thebelongcollective.org and learn more about who we are. We are an inclusive, Jesus-shaped community practicing the way of love for the good of all. We do interviews like this sometimes for our Sunday morning sermon. Sometimes we do meetups in Hershey area, Harrisburg area. So if you're in that area, interested in connecting, or you just want to connect with us online and follow us online, we would love that. We have a YouTube channel you could subscribe to. We also have a Facebook page and even a Facebook group where you can share prayer requests or needs. We would love for you to connect with us. So go to thebelongcollective.org. If you have questions, you can email me, Justin, at thebelongcollective.org. I would love to connect with you. Thank you for joining us for this special Wednesday night production of my interview with Dr. George Hajduczok, and I definitely want to thank him for all of his time and effort in sharing and just updating all of us on the history of Ukraine. Thanks to him. Y'all have a good rest of your evening.